Now we're going to talk about percent, converting percent to decimals or representing percent as decimal. The long way to represent percent would be dividing by 100 first and then multiplying by the number of the percent. So I would divide by 100 and then I would multiply by 75. Or I could represent this as 75 hundredths, which is 0.75. So 75% is 0.75 or 0.75. 20%, 0.2. 35%, 0.35. 70%, 0.7. Easy enough, isn't it? Now, if I see a decimal, and I know that that's percent represented that way, I'm doing it the other way around. I will have to move my decimal. Here, I moved my decimal to the left twice. Here, I'm going to move my decimal to the right twice. So 7 hundredths is 7%. So 7 hundredths of something is 7% of that something. 0.45 is 45%. 0.003, that's 1, 2, that's where my decimal point would land, which means that's not 3% quite. It's actually 0.3%. So 3/10 of a percent. 125, you know that 1 is 100%, so I have 100% and 25. So that means that I have 125 moving twice to the right leads me to 125%. Boom, that's a lot. Now, what is something percent of something something? When you're finding percent of a number, you're multiplying by that decimal. So think about what 25% is represented as a decimal. That's 0.25. So when I'm finding 25% of 300, all I'm doing is I'm taking that 300 and I'm multiplying it by 0.25. And here's a trick. The 300 has 2 zeros and 0.25 has 2 decimal places. I can take these 2 zeros and multiply them. Not multiply the zeros, but apply those 2 zeros to move my decimal point. So this 300 times 0.25 will turn into 3 times 25, which is, what do you know, 75. So 20% of 300 is 75. What is 70% of 1200 or 1200? We're going to turn this into a decimal, which is 0.7, and we'll multiply the 1200 by it. I will chip off 1 0. I will chip off the decimal point. So that would lead me to 120 times 7. Now this would give me 70, this would give me 140, so it's going to be 700 plus 140, that's 840. So 70% of 1200 is 840. The next couple, find 45% of 9,000. So 45%, again, turn this into a decimal, 0.45 times 9,000. I'm going to chip off my decimal point using the 2 zeros, and that will lead me to 45 times 90. Now 45 times 9, let's look at 40 times 9, that's 360. Plus 5 times 9 is 45. So that will give me 405. But then I was multiplying by 90. So then that would lead me to 50. So 45% of 9,000 is 4,050. Right? What is 80% of 16,000? Again, 0.8. Chip off, chip off. So that's going to be 8 times 16. That gives me 80 plus 48, which is 128. And then I still have 2 zeros. So that gives me 128 with 2 zeros, or 12,800. So these were for finding percent, certain amount of percent of a certain number. A certain number is a certain amount of percent of another number, if that makes sense. So I know that 360 is 90% of some kind of number. How do I find what that original number was? Well, think about what we just did. Here, we were finding 25% of 300, and what we did, we took the 300 and multiplied by the decimal representation of 25%. So we did 300 times 0.25. So I took a certain number x, multiplied it by 0.9, because that's what 90% is, and I ended up with 360. So then how would I find my number x? To find x, I would take 360 and I would divide it by 0.9. All right, so 360 divided by 0.9. Well, I am not a big fan of dividing by decimals. So I'm going to turn 0.9 into a 9. How do I do that? I multiply by 10. But if I multiply the bottom by 10, I have to multiply the top by 10. So it's going to be 3,600 divided by 9. And now look at 36 over 9, that's a 4. And then I still have my 2 zeros, so 400. So 360 is 90% of 400. Kaboom. And think about it. When we find 90% of something, we chip off 10% of something. What is 10% of 400? Well, 10% of 400 is 40. And then 400 minus 40 is indeed 360. Boom, we're good all around. Let's look at the next one. 540 is 60% of what? In order to figure out what that secret number is, I'm going to remember that 60% is 0.6. And since I'm finding the number of which 60% is 540, I will take the 540 and I will divide it by 0.6. Again, I don't like dividing by decimals. I'm going to turn this into a 6 by multiplying both parts of the fraction times 10. So that's going to be 5,400 over 6. 54 over 6 gives me a 9, and I am left with 2 zeros after that. So that's going to be 900. Boom, 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 boom. Next, 200 is 40% of, again, 0.4 is 40%. 200 divided by 0.4 is like 2,000 divided by 4. 20 over 4 is going to be 5, and then 2 zeros after that. So 200 is 40% of 500. And you can always check, if you take 500 and multiply by 0.4, you will indeed get 200. Now, 700 is 35% of what? Again, 700, we will have to divide by the decimal representation of 35%, which is 0.35. Now I'm going to get rid of my decimality. 700 multiplied both sides, both the top and the bottom, by 100 will give me 35. Now I know that 70 is double of 35. So 70 over 35 will give me a 2. And then I have the leftover zeros, all the 3 of them. So 35% of 2,000 is 700. 400 is 80% of 0.8. 400 over 0.8 is like 4,000 by 8. 40 over 8. 5 and 2 zeros left over. 500. 6,000 is 30% of 6,000 over 0.3. 60,000 over 3. Well, easy. That is going to be 20,000. Boom, 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 boom.